In the dense night fog on the St. Lawrence River, one of the swiftest and deadliest shipwrecks in history unfolded in just 14 minutes. The liner Empress of Ireland was going down, taking the lives of 1,012 people with her. This occurred just 2 years after the Titanic, yet here even more passengers perished. However, in total lives lost, passengers plus crew, the Titanic surpasses the Empress, 1,500 plus versus 1,012. And yet, this disaster was nearly forgotten, eclipsed by the coming World War. Why did people stop speaking of it? It was a catastrophe that should have shaken the world. But the world, alas, was too preoccupied to remember it. The ship Empress of Ireland sank on May 29, 1914, just 2 years after the Titanic and a mere 2 months before machine guns on Europe's borders would shatter the silence, beginning the First World War. The coming slaughter simply eclipsed this tragedy, casting it into the shadows of history. And yet the scale of what happened is staggering. The total number of lives lost, 1,012, is less than on the Titanic. But when looking at passengers, the picture is different. On the Empress, 840 passengers perished. That is more passenger lives lost than on the Titanic or later, the Lusitania. It is this figure that makes it the largest peacetime maritime disaster in Canadian history. A tragedy forgotten by time, but one that has lost none of its bitterness. She was one of the flagships of the Canadian Pacific Railway, the pride of its Atlantic fleet. RMS Empress of Ireland was built at the Fairfield shipyard in Govan, Scotland, and launched in 1906. Nearly 570 feet long, with twin screws and a speed of 18 knots, she was built for reliable service on the Liverpool to Quebec route, carrying up to 1,500 passengers across the ocean. Her sister ship, Empress of Britain, was already at sea, and together they represented the power and ambition of Canada on the transatlantic routes. She was not the most luxurious, but a sturdy and proven vessel, a dependable workhorse of the sea. In command of this voyage was a man whose name was already well known throughout Britain's maritime community, Captain Henry George Kendall, an experienced seaman, for whom this was his first voyage as captain of the Empress of Ireland. However, he had worked on the Quebec line and for the Canadian Pacific Company for many years and knew the route exceptionally well. But 4 years prior to this tragedy, Kendall had already made history by doing something unprecedented. In 1910, while in command of the steamship Montrose, he suspected 2 of his passengers were not who they claimed to be. With the shrewdness of a detective, he recognized them as the fugitive murderer, Dr. Hawley Harvey Crippen, and his mistress, traveling under false names. Using the latest technological marvel, the ship's radio telegraph, Kendall secretly contacted Scotland Yard. As a result, Crippen was arrested upon the ship's arrival, becoming the world's first criminal caught by radio. This incident brought Captain Kendall fame and a reputation as a cool-headed and decisive man. Now, in May 1914, he was tasked with guiding his magnificent new liner through the foggy waters of the St. Lawrence River. His previous success only underscored the terrible irony that lay ahead. Aboard the Empress of Ireland were 477 people, over 1,000 passengers and 400 crew members. It was a routine transatlantic crossing with its usual bustle. The cabins held families of emigrants, businesspeople, and tourists. Children played on the decks, 138 of them in total. The ship was full of life, hopes, and plans. But among all the passengers, one large, tightly knit group stood out. This was a delegation of the Salvation Army, traveling from Canada to London for its 4th International Congress. On board were about 170 officers and soldiers of the organization, men, women, and even children. They sailed with their brass instruments, in full dress uniform, preparing for a major event. Among them were Commissioner David Rees with his wife and 3 children, Colonel Maidment and his wife, and Bandmaster Hannigan with his young daughter, Grace. This was not merely a group of passengers. It was a fellowship united by a common faith and purpose. None of them could have imagined that fewer than 10 would return alive. On the evening of May 28, 1914, the Empress of Ireland, having taken 477 souls aboard, cast off from the Quebec City wharf and headed down the mighty St. Lawrence River. This was her usual transatlantic route. Liverpool lay ahead. On the bridge stood Captain Henry Kendall, for whom this voyage was his first command, but by no means the first in a career already marked by distinction. The ship proceeded along its customary path, past familiar shores on the cusp of a summer night. Late in the evening, now May 29, at Pointe-au-Père, as was customary, the river pilot disembarked. Now the Empress proceeded independently, under the command of her captain, into open waters. The night was quiet and initially clear, but over the river's cold waters, a veil was thickening, a dense, milky fog slowly creeping in from the sea, preparing to become a fatal participant in the drama. Meanwhile, in that same fog, on that same river, another ship was underway. This was the Norwegian collier Storstad. It was heading upstream towards Quebec with a massive cargo, some 11,000 tons of coal. Its bow, with its massive steel frames and stem, was not that of an icebreaker or a vessel specially reinforced for ice. Due to its design, its nose acted like a rigid steel wedge, but this was not a structural defense against ice. It was simply strong, blunt, like a battering ram. On the bridge, on this fateful night, Captain Thomas Anderson was not present. He was resting in his cabin. The watch was being kept by the first mate, Alfred Toffeens. The two vessels, the Empress of Ireland and the Storstad, were relentlessly closing in on each other in the darkness, separated only by a band of thickening fog. The night was clear, and the lights of the oncoming vessel were clearly visible from both ships. The captains exchanged whistle signals, believing they had agreed on a maneuver, but in this exchange lay the fatal error. Captain Kendall of the Empress was certain the ships had agreed to pass starboard to starboard. The Norwegian collier Storstad, however, believed the agreement was to pass port to port. This misunderstanding would soon prove fatal. A thick fog rolled between the ships, a wall of gloom completely obscuring each other's lights. Each captain remained in his own isolation, guided by his own understanding of the situation. And in this veil, one of them made the decision to alter course. Whose specific maneuver led to the catastrophe is a question that still has no definitive answer. From the fog suddenly loomed the giant silhouette of the collier. The bow of the Storstad, with its massive steel frames and stem, was not that of an icebreaker or a vessel specially reinforced for ice. Due to its construction, its bow acted like a rigid steel wedge. It was not a structural protection against ice, so it did not crumple on impact, but instead, like a giant can opener, drove deep into the liner's hull. Against this tranquil maritime backdrop, one of the swiftest tragedies in the history of seafaring begins. The time is 1:56 a.m. on May 29, 1914. The fates of more than 1,500 people converge at a single point on the St. Lawrence River. From a suddenly descending veil of fog, a dark mass materialized before the Empress of Ireland. It was the bow of the Norwegian collier Storstad. It did not glance off the side or ricochet away. It struck at full speed, like a steel battering ram, and with terrifying force plunged into the liner's starboard side almost amidships. The blow landed below the waterline. The destruction was instantaneous and catastrophic. The Empress's steel plating parted, creating a gash roughly 14 feet wide and 25 feet deep. And behind that steel wound lay the heart of the ship, its boiler rooms. The water of the icy river poured inside with colossal force. Popular accounts would later speak of 60,000 gallons per second, though this figure is not corroborated by primary sources. But the scale of the disaster was obvious even without precise measurements. The ocean had crashed directly into its most vulnerable place. The ship, which just moments before had been proudly sailing toward the sea, had received a mortal wound, and the clock began its countdown. 14 minutes, that is precisely how long it took from the moment of impact until the massive liner vanished beneath the surface. So why did the Empress of Ireland sink so swiftly, far faster than the Titanic? The Canadian inquiry, led by Lord Mersey, identified three key reasons. The first was the fatal nature of the breach itself. The bow of the Storstad penetrated deep into the starboard side, directly into the area of the boiler rooms. The frigid river water surged into the ship's heart, instantly disabling its power system. The second reason was the ship's safety design. The Empress of Ireland was fitted with a hydrodynamic door-closing system, the Stone Lloyd system, which allowed most watertight doors to be closed remotely from the bridge, or manually. However, due to the instant loss of power, the severe list, and the rapid flooding, the stokers and crew simply could not activate the mechanisms, either hydraulically or by hand, before the water jammed the doors, much like on some modern liners. And the third tragic detail involved the portholes. The day had been unusually warm, and passengers in their cabins had opened them for fresh air. As night fell, no one thought to close them. When the ship began listing sharply to starboard, these open ports submerged, adding powerful torrents to the already flooding compartments. The rapidly increasing list proved fatal. People on the lower decks were trapped. The lifeboats on the port side, now high in the air, were impossible to launch at such an angle, and nearly all the lifeboats on the starboard side were either smashed in the collision or already awash. Contrary to popular myth, a distress call was indeed sent. The Empress of Ireland's radio operators, Ronald Ferguson and Edward Bamford, standing waist-deep in freezing water at their posts, managed to broadcast an SOS and their coordinates, which later guided rescue ships. But for the liner itself, there was no more time. Just 14 minutes after meeting the collier at 2:10 a.m., the RMS Empress of Ireland disappeared beneath the dark waters of the St. Lawrence River. The final death toll of the disaster is horrifying. Of the 477 people on board, 1,012 perished. 840 of them were passengers. This exceeds the number of passenger lives lost on the Titanic or later on the Lusitania. Among the passengers was a large delegation, about 170 officers and soldiers of the Salvation Army sailing to an international congress in London. Fewer than 10 of them survived. Commissioner David Rees, seeing his wife had no lifebelt, gave her his own. They both perished, along with their 3 children. Colonel Maidment and his wife also died, leaving 6 children orphaned. Bandmaster Hannigan did not survive, but his 7-year-old daughter Grace was miraculously saved, left an orphan. She would become the last surviving member of the Salvation Army delegation, living a long life until her death in 1995. Of the 138, some sources say 134 children on board, only 4 survived, all girls: Grace Hannigan, Florence Barber, Luvis Webb, and Roland/Arvo Marcu/Arvo Markey, though Arvo Markula was a 14-year-old teenager/boy, sometimes counted among the children. Their stories are rare glimmers of light in this monstrous tragedy, which claimed so many lives in just 14 minutes. Shortly after the disaster, investigative hearings began. The Canadian inquiry was led by Lord Mersey, the same judge who, just 2 years prior, had overseen the inquiry into the loss of the Titanic. After 11 days of proceedings, the Canadian Commission delivered its verdict. The blame lay with the Norwegian collier, the Storstad. The chief accused was First Officer Alfred Toffeens, who, according to the investigation, altered the ship's course in thick fog without summoning the captain. However, the Norwegian investigation, conducted in parallel, reached the exact opposite conclusion. It fully exonerated the Storstad's crew and placed the blame on the Empress's captain, Henry Kendall, asserting that it was he, by stopping his vessel in the shipping lane and altering course, who had provoked the collision. Kendall, officially cleared by the Canadian Commission, maintained his innocence until his death in 1965. A unanimous verdict was never reached. Canada blamed the Norwegians, Norway blamed the Canadian ship, and even modern historians, analyzing the documents, lean toward the version of mutual error, leaving this question open to this day. She lies there to this day, at a depth of about 40 meters in the icy waters of the St. Lawrence River, on her starboard side, just as she sank. Strong currents, poor visibility, and water temperatures around 4 degrees Celsius make diving to the wreck of the Empress of Ireland the domain of only the most experienced divers. For many years, the site was plundered. Souvenir hunters took everything from the depths, from the ship's bell to porcelain. But today, the sunken liner is protected by law as a cultural heritage object and a national historic site. Artifacts from her can now be seen in a museum, the site historique Maritime de la Pointe-au-Père in Rimouski, where, alongside the exhibition dedicated to the disaster, the submarine Onondaga is also birthed. So why did this tragedy, which claimed over 1,000 lives, fade into obscurity? The First World War had begun, and news from the front quickly overshadowed the maritime disaster. There was no global elite on board. As with the Titanic, the victims were mostly emigrants and a delegation from the Salvation Army. Nor was there the geopolitical resonance of the sinking of the Lusitania. Thus, the Empress of Ireland became a forgotten disaster, resting quietly in the cold waters of a Canadian river, a tragic story worth remembering.